Warning. This episode contains political commentary, satire, and discussion of alleged government fraud, selective media coverage, and institutional failure. Facts, opinions, and sarcasm may be presented side by side, which can be confusing for people who still think the government has their best interests at heart. Listener discretion is advised, especially if accountability makes you uncomfortable.
Isn't it amazing how fast Americans forget things, especially when the people in charge are hoping we do? One minute we're told there's a historic fraud scandal, hundreds of millions of dollars meant to feed kids somehow disappearing faster than Hunter Biden's laptop at a press conference. And the next minute, nothing. Crickets. Cue the next outrage. Apparently, if you just wait long enough, slap a new headline on the screen and yell racism or democracy loud enough, the public memory resets like a busted iPhone. Because here's the thing. This wasn't ancient history. This wasn't the 90s. This wasn't unverified claims. This was real money, real investigations, real arrests, and real fraud, and yet somehow it fell straight down the media memory hole like it never happened. So tonight, we're not here to ask what happened. That part's already on the record. We're here to ask the question nobody on cable news wants to touch. Why were we told to forget, and who benefits from that silence? All right, let's bring in the crew, because nothing says healthy democracy like 5 people yelling at each other politely while the government loses money like it's playing Monopoly with your paycheck. First up, Brian, our resident MAGA flamethrower. If a bureaucrat says, we're looking into it, Brian hears, we already shredded the paperwork, and honestly, he's usually not wrong. Next, Rachel, the independent, the truth hunter, the one person here who can say 2 things can be true without the internet spontaneously combusting. She's basically the show's human fact check with better timing. Then Daniel, our conspiracy board chairman. If there's a pattern, he sees it. If there's no pattern, he'll build one. Somewhere out there, a corkboard is missing thumbtacks and Daniel is the prime suspect. And finally, Skylar, our resident progressive Green Party perspective, and the only person brave enough to walk into the studio like, actually capitalism is the villain, and then sit between Brian and Daniel like that's a normal life choice. And I'm Artie, your host, your referee, and the guy trying to keep this thing from turning into Thanksgiving dinner with microphones. Before we go any further, let me be clear about something. What's happening right now involving ICE is tragic. Any loss of life is tragic, and there absolutely needs to be a full, transparent investigation to get to the bottom of what happened. No spin, no rushing to judgment, no sweeping it under the rug. Accountability matters, period. But here's what keeps bothering me. Less than a month ago, we were all talking about Minnesota for a very different reason. Massive fraud, millions of taxpayer dollars meant for pandemic relief, funneled through fake nonprofits and shell organizations with warning signs ignored and oversight nowhere to be found. That story mattered. It was real. It affected everyone who pays taxes. And now, nothing. Crickets. The moment a new crisis hits, the previous one doesn't get resolved. It just gets erased. And that's the pattern worth talking about tonight. Not whether investigations are important. They are. But why some investigations stay in the spotlight while others quietly disappear once they become inconvenient. So let's start there. Brian, when regular Americans make a mistake on their taxes, the IRS shows up like it's a federal manhunt. But when millions disappear through government programs, we're told to move on, focus on the next tragedy, and stop asking uncomfortable questions. So tell me, is this just incompetence? Or is this selective outrage doing exactly what it's designed to do? Take it away.
Yeah, Artie, this isn't incompetence. Incompetence is spilling coffee on your keyboard, not losing hundreds of millions of dollars and then acting surprised when people notice. This is selective outrage, plain and simple. When the fraud story broke in Minnesota, it didn't fit the right narrative, so it got treated like leftovers in the fridge. Acknowledge it exists, promise you'll deal with it later, and then quietly shove it to the back until it starts to smell, and you pretend you don't know where it came from. And the part that drives people nuts is the double standard. You're exactly right. Mess up a tax form by $50, and suddenly the IRS is calling like, "Sir, we just want to talk." But when the government lights piles of cash on fire through fake nonprofits, we're told it's complicated, nuanced, and somehow racist to ask follow-up questions. Funny how accountability always gets real fuzzy when the wrong people might look bad. Look, the ICE situation is serious, and it deserves a real investigation. No argument there. But tragedy doesn't erase corruption, and outrage shouldn't come with an expiration date. You don't get to swap one scandal for another like it's cable news bingo. If the media actually cared about justice instead of vibes, they'd be able to cover both at the same time. But they can't, because one story helps the narrative, and the other exposes the grift. So no, this isn't about compassion or complexity, it's about control. Keep people angry, keep them distracted, and hope they forget where the money went. And judging by the silence right now, that strategy works way more often than it should.
That leftovers in the fridge line is painfully accurate, and the worst part is eventually the smell hits regular Americans, not the people who made the mess. Because you're right, Brian, the standard isn't what's serious, it's what's useful. And I want to sit on something you said for a second. Tragedy doesn't erase corruption. That's the line. Two things can be true at the same time, but somehow we're only allowed to talk about one of them at once. It's like the media has a one story at a time brain, and coincidentally, it's always the story that lets government off the hook for past failures. Because here's what gets lost in all of this. Accountability isn't cruelty. Asking where the money went isn't hate. And demanding answers doesn't suddenly make you heartless just because a newer crisis showed up. If anything, it should make us more careful, not less. So Rachel, let me bring you in here, because you're usually the one who cuts through the noise. When stories like the Minnesota fraud just quietly disappear, what does that do to public trust? And at what point do people stop believing investigations are about truth and start believing they're about narrative management?
What it does to public trust, Artie, is it corrodes it from the inside out. People don't stop believing in institutions overnight. They stop believing after they see the same pattern repeat over and over again. A big story breaks. Officials promise transparency. The media amplifies just enough outrage to look responsible. And then the moment attention shifts, the follow-through disappears. That's not accountability. That's performance. And the Minnesota fraud case is a perfect example of why people are so cynical now. This wasn't a rumor or a partisan attack. It was documented fraud involving taxpayer money during a national crisis. When that kind of story fades without resolution, the message to the public is clear. Investigations matter only until they become inconvenient or politically uncomfortable. That's when silence replaces scrutiny. The danger here isn't just that people get angry, it's that they disengage. They stop believing that oversight is real or that outcomes are fair. And once that trust is gone, it doesn't matter how many press conferences you hold or how many investigations you announce. People assume the ending is already written. That's why it's so important to say this clearly. Demanding accountability doesn't mean dismissing tragedy. We can acknowledge the seriousness of what's happening with ICE and still insist on answers about where public money went and who failed to stop it. In fact, if institutions were consistent about accountability, there would be less suspicion, not more. Selective outrage doesn't protect democracy. It convinces people it isn't working the way they were promised.
That point about disengagement is huge, Rachel, because once people stop believing the system even wants the truth, it doesn't matter how many independent investigations get announced. They all sound the same. It starts to feel less like accountability and more like a holding pattern until everyone gets bored and moves on. And you're right, selective outrage doesn't calm people down, it radicalizes them. When accountability looks optional, people either check out completely or start assuming there's something being deliberately hidden. Neither one is healthy, and both of them are entirely predictable, which brings me to Daniel. Because Daniel, this isn't just about media failure or bad optics. This is about patterns. Fraud stories cooling off, enforcement stories exploding, narratives swapping right on schedule. And every time, we're told it's organic, coincidental, and totally unrelated. So let me ask you this. When you step back and look at how these stories rise and vanish, do you see chaos or do you see coordination? And who actually benefits when attention keeps getting redirected right before accountability kicks in?
I don't see chaos at all, Artie. Chaos is messy and unpredictable. What I see is something much cleaner than that. Patterns don't repeat by accident this consistently. Every time a story threatens institutional credibility, fraud, oversight failure, money trails, attention gets redirected to something emotionally explosive that's impossible to discuss calmly. Tragedy, outrage, fear. Those stories don't require spreadsheets or audits. They require reactions. And look, I'm not saying there's some shadowy room where everyone sits around twirling mustaches. It doesn't have to work like that anymore. The incentives are built into the system. Media outlets chase engagement, politicians chase narrative control, and bureaucracies chase survival. When all three benefit from the same distraction, coordination doesn't need a memo. It just happens. The Minnesota fraud story demanded uncomfortable questions. Who signed off? Who ignored warnings? Where did the money actually go? That's dangerous territory because once you start answering those questions, you don't just expose a few bad actors. You expose a system that allowed it. And systems protect themselves. So the story cools off. Coverage fades. And suddenly, everyone's told it's already been addressed, even when it clearly hasn't. And here's the part that really gets me. People sense this. They might not articulate it, but they feel it. That's why trust collapses. That's why every new investigation is met with eye rolls. It's not conspiracy thinking, it's pattern recognition. And until accountability becomes consistent instead of selective, these cycles will keep repeating. Outrage, distraction, silence, on a loop that benefits everyone except the public.
The phrase that sticks with me there is pattern recognition. Because whether people agree with you or not, Daniel, that's what a lot of Americans feel like they're doing right now. Noticing that the same types of stories always cool off right before the uncomfortable questions start getting asked. And I want to underline something you said that matters. This doesn't require some secret smoke-filled room. Systems don't need villains twirling mustaches to protect themselves. Incentives do the work. Attention shifts, pressure eases, and accountability quietly slips out the back door. But this is exactly where I want to bring Skylar in, because not everyone sees this as coordination or institutional self-preservation. Some people genuinely believe these shifts are about urgency, harm, and prioritizing human impact. So, Skylar, let me ask you this. From your perspective, is this selective outrage? Or is it simply society reacting to the most immediate harm in front of it? And how do you respond to the concern that moving on too fast leaves serious issues like fraud permanently unresolved?
I think there's some truth in what everyone here is saying, but I don't see it as coordination so much as a failure of priorities mixed with human behavior. When people are confronted with immediate harm, loss of life, fear in their communities, images that hit emotionally, that's naturally going to take precedence in public attention. That doesn't mean other issues stop mattering, but it does mean they stop feeling urgent to people who aren't directly affected. Where I agree with you, though, is that urgency shouldn't erase responsibility. The Minnesota fraud didn't become less serious just because something else happened. Those were public funds meant to help vulnerable people during a crisis. And when stories like that fade without resolution, it sends the message that financial crimes without visible victims are somehow easier to ignore. Even though the harm is real and long-term, I also think media incentives play a bigger role than ideology alone. Outrage-driven stories are easier to package and faster to consume than investigations that require context and follow-up. That doesn't make it a conspiracy, but it does make it a structural problem. And when institutions rely on attention cycles instead of sustained accountability, trust erodes, especially among people who already feel the system isn't designed to work for them. So I don't think the answer is choosing between compassion for tragedy and accountability for fraud. We should be capable of both. If we aren't, then the problem isn't the public, it's the way information is filtered and prioritized. And until that changes, these conversations are going to keep repeating, no matter which side people are on.
This is why conversations like this matter and why they're so uncomfortable for people in power. You heard different perspectives tonight, not because the truth is subjective, but because the problem is bigger than one headline or one ideology. Whether you see this as coordination, media incentives, or a failure of priorities, the outcome is the same. Serious issues don't get resolved, they just get replaced. Tragedy deserves accountability, fraud deserves accountability, and neither one should cancel the other out. If we only demand answers when it's emotionally convenient, then we're not actually holding anyone accountable. We're just reacting. And reaction is easy. Accountability is work. It's uncomfortable. It's boring. And it doesn't fit neatly into a chyron at the bottom of a screen. So if there's one takeaway from this segment, it's this. Don't let yourself be told what you're allowed to remember. Don't let outrage cycles decide which questions are worth asking, because the moment we stop demanding consistent accountability is the moment the system learns it can wait us out. That's not left or right. That's citizen versus institution.
All right, before we roll into final thoughts, quick timeout. Because if you're still paying attention, that means you're exactly the kind of person this show is for. If you want to support Data and Dissonance without relying on corporate sponsors or media gatekeepers, hit the merch store. We've got the gear that says what a lot of people are thinking but aren't allowed to say out loud. Shirts, hats, coffee, and designs that don't apologize for asking questions. Every purchase helps keep this show independent, uncensored, and completely immune to the "we'll get back to you after the election" crowd. Links in the description. Grab something, wear it, trigger a conversation. All right, let's close this out.
Tonight wasn't about picking a side. It wasn't about minimizing tragedy, excusing failure, or pretending complex problems have simple answers. It was about something much more basic: memory. What we choose to remember, what we're encouraged to forget, and who benefits when our attention keeps getting reset like a broken clock. We can hold more than one truth at the same time. We can demand full investigations into tragic incidents involving ICE and still ask hard questions about massive fraud that affected taxpayers and vulnerable communities. Those positions don't contradict each other, they reinforce each other. Accountability isn't selective, or at least it shouldn't be, and when it becomes selective, trust doesn't just erode, it collapses. What frustrates people isn't outrage, it's inconsistency. It's watching one story dominate the airwaves for weeks while another quietly disappears the moment it threatens institutions instead of individuals. It's being told to move on before answers are given, while being told to never forget only when it's politically convenient. That's not justice, that's narrative management. And here's the dangerous part. When citizens feel like accountability is optional, they disengage, they stop listening, they stop believing. Or worse, they assume everything is rigged and nothing matters. That's not healthy skepticism, that's a breakdown in the relationship between the public and the systems meant to serve them. So if there's one thing I hope you take from tonight, it's this. Don't let the news cycle decide what deserves closure. Don't let outrage replace oversight. And don't let anyone tell you that asking questions makes you heartless. It makes you a citizen. Because a system that can't survive scrutiny isn't strong, it's fragile. And a society that forgets too easily is easy to control. Remember to speak truth, stir thought.
Tonight's episode of Data and Dissonance is brought to you by the Caleb Rourke Thriller series. Because sometimes fiction is the only place you're allowed to tell the truth out loud. If you're tired of headlines that never quite connect the dots, start with the Covenant Protocol, where power, secrecy, and global manipulation aren't theories. They're the plot. Then move straight into the Prophet Directive, where the lines between intelligence agencies, ideology, and control get even thinner. And now available, Black Echo Rising, the latest installment, pulling back the curtain on what happens when silence becomes policy and accountability becomes optional. If you like your thrillers grounded, fast-paced, and uncomfortably relevant, the Caleb Rourke series was written for you. Links are in the description. And while you're there, check out Uncaged, the album. Raw, unfiltered. No label polish, no corporate permission, just music that says what a lot of people are thinking but aren't supposed to say. Available wherever you stream music. Books, music, independent voices. That's how you keep the conversation alive.